Okay, everybody, welcome to University 100, the summer edition. Today we're going to be talking about effective note taking. Um, by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to reflect on your current note taking practices, what's working for you and what's not working. Recall cognitively beneficial note taking strategies and develop a note taking strategy for yourself and a strategy to study from those notes that you've taken. As we talked about last time, when you're in a new learning situation, your mind is an open field without any nice, clean pathways to get from one place to another yet, and you're going to build those. The same when you're taking notes. It's kind of like that blank sheet of paper in front of you in class. You're going to fill it with stuff that's hopefully we fill it with stuff that's actually going to help you in your learning pathway. So by the end of that lecture, you have neural pathways that kind of look like this. They're fairly well developed. You've gotten some good ideas. You've made some synthesized some concepts that were talked about in class. You wrote down important things that you needed to know, and you're able to make connections with things that you remember from your prior knowledge in your past. Um, then you put those notes away for 4 or 5 weeks before your test, and then you come back to those things, and your memories are going to kind of look like this. So we're going to talk about how you can extend your learning so that after those 4 or 5 weeks, when the test comes, you look a lot more like this than this. So the most important single thing you can do to help yourself in this situation is to be prepared for class. That's your most important note-taking strategy. If you walk into that class prepared, you'll be a lot more able to predict what is going to be said in class. You'll know what main points are, what are side topics, what are things that you probably don't need to write down. So, activating your prior knowledge is one of the best things you can do to get your brain ready to take notes. First, do the readings. If you're assigned a reading before class, do it. Doing that reading will help prepare you, and you'll for that next lecture, you'll know what basically your professor is going to talk about. You'll know what's in the book, so you know what you don't have to write down everything that's in the book. You know when the professor is going away from the book or talking about drawing conclusions from things in your textbook or the readings that you're asked to do. So those become important things to write down those conclusions, not necessarily all the stuff that you remember from the book. Um, Look at the lecture topic. Even if you don't have a reading for that week, you probably have a course schedule and you know what that lecture is going to be on. Get on the internet and do some research. Figure out a little bit about what the topic is to prepare your brain when you walk into that class. Your brain will have some concepts about the lecture topic, and that will make processing during the lecture a whole lot easier. So if you have some of that stuff already in your mind, it makes taking notes and understanding what's going on a lot easier, and you walk away with notes that are actually helpful to you. So, how much is enough? How much is too much? And as in all things in life, the answer is it depends. Um, so, I'd like you all to think for just a minute about how you have taken notes in the class and what is your biggest challenge to note taking in class. Um, I've got a couple of archetypes of things. The guy who writes too much. I call them the lecture stenographer. They just write down everything that's being said. Um, Not necessarily a good idea. We'll talk about that, why that's not such a great idea. The guy who misses all the important points, the randomizer. He just writes down things that have aren't the important topic or side topics and thinks that he's getting all the information, but he's missed all the main points. The guy who can't stay focused, the drifter. He starts, 5 minutes into lecture, he's looking out the window, he's looking at what some of the other students have on their phones when they're getting distracted, doing anything but paying attention. So then you wind up your notes have big gaps in them and things like that. The last one is not knowing how to study your notes later. I call them the rereader because that's probably the least effective note taking strategy or note studying strategy you can use is just rereading your notes. And we'll talk about why that is here in a little bit. So, what do you write down? Ideally, when you're taking notes, you're writing down main ideas, main topics, concepts, theories, models, procedures, laws, things like that. Those things are important to write down. And back to our example from the first class where I talked about the founding of the Jamestown colony. So you have a history professor lecturing about the transatlantic era. He's lecturing on mercantilism. And instead of transcribing every word that he says, or on the other point, writing down just simply that he talked for 10 minutes on mercantilism without any detail of what was talked about. You could write something like just a flow chart kind of. The rise of the nation state led to the need for money for armies because these nation states like to fight with each other, which led to the economic policy of mercantilism so they could leverage the merchant class to help the crown, and which also led to the founding of the Virginia Company and the East India Company, which gave us the Jamestown Colony in Virginia and the New Amsterdam Colony in New York. And if that's all you write down and you were paying attention in class and you go back and read your lecture notes, you see that little chart, then all that stuff will come flowing back to you because you didn't overwrite, you were paying attention while you were taking notes, you wrote down the key flow of ideas, and so it makes it a lot easier for those to build back into your memory and your learning. There's kind of a three-question filter you can ask yourself when you're taking notes. Is this a main idea? If it is, yeah, write it down. Is this a relationship between two ideas? Is the professor comparing stuff that were either described separately in your readings or some other way, but now he's bringing them together in class? That's important to write down. Or does this look like something that's going to be on your test at the end of the month? Then, for all those things, yes, write those things down. And the reason you don't transcribe your lectures, writing something down does not mean you're remembering it or you're learning from it. You have limited cognitive capacity. Your working memory can only hold between 2 and 7 things in it at any one given time. And if you're using a bunch of that up while you're writing and transcribing, trying to listen to every word that's being said and then writing them all down, you're using up a lot of that cognitive capacity for that and not any of it for the learning process, which is really the reason you're in that lecture. Learning requires processing, not just simply recording things that are going on. And when you're transcribing a lecture, it kind of creates the illusion that you're actually learning stuff, but when in reality all you're doing is transcribing things, and you might remember some of it, but you're not really thinking and learning. Transcribing is competing with your thinking. So the less writing you're doing and the more thinking and paying attention you're doing, the better. But as with every rule, there are exceptions to every rule. Sometimes you need to write things down. If it's precise or technical information where you need the exact wording from something, write that down. Is it a legal concept? Sometimes legalese needs to be written exactly the right way to make it make sense or to make it work in the legal system. Definitions and terminology, sometimes you need to write all those down. That's fine. Directions, lab procedures, you want to make sure you get those right, things like that. Um, Also, if you're sharing notes with somebody, say you're taking notes for a sick classmate, you'll need to take more detailed notes for someone who's not there than for someone who is paying attention during that lecture. Sometimes professors talk really fast. And if the lecture is really fast paced, sometimes you're kind of stuck in doing that. And whatever, sometimes you have to survive a lecture and you might take more notes and do less thinking during the class than you otherwise would. Occasionally, all of us professor types, we're human beings. We don't always do things perfectly. If you wind up with a poorly structured lecture, then sometimes taking more detailed notes there makes sense because if it's the lecture is not structured very logically, then your learning won't follow. And if your learning doesn't follow, then if nothing else, you have something written down that you can start to pick apart and learn from. Also, if you're a novice, if it's your first time experiencing something or learning something, you're going to do more writing, which is also why you do the reading before class and you come in prepared so you're not as much of a novice when you walk into for that lecture. But those are times when you might want to write down some more. The real rule is that the goal isn't to avoid transcription completely. The goal is to avoid mindless transcription. If that's all you're walking in to do is transcribe notes, then you're probably walking in with not a great strategy. Um, Ask, am I writing this down because it needs to be captured, or am I afraid of missing something? strategic note taking kind of looks like you capture important information accurately, you organize it into meaningful structure so you can make sense of it later, you add in your own explanations so you're doing a little thinking and processing on it and summarizing on your own, then you review and retrieve it later so you start to re um, interact with that information, and so it strengthens your neural pathways. Um, in other words, the best note takers aren't scribes. They're editors. They're constantly deciding what matters, what connects, and what will be useful for them when studying later. So we'll look at a couple of note taking strategies. You could be the write it all down person, and your notes may come out looking like this, which is a lot. And it is a lot to study from. And it looks like this is someone's nursing class because it looks like a bunch of pharmacology stuff. I'm not a medical professional, so I can't tell you for sure, but there is a lot written down on these pages, and that's going to be hard for you to study from. Plus, if you did that much writing in class, the chances of you paying a lot of attention is pretty much zero. So you probably didn't get a whole lot from being at that lecture. So all you have is this piece of paper to show for it. Chaotic notes, everything's kind of all over the place. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And you go back to study it in a month if you hadn't looked at it in a while, and this is just going to look like gobbledygook, and you're not going to be able to make much sense of it. And then there's the minimalist. If your notes come away looking like this, you didn't take notes. So you want to take some kind of notes to remember the things that you're doing in class. So I recommend not doing this. There is a method of note taking called the Cornell method, which I like in that it forces you to do some cognitively appropriate things with your note taking. First, in that big box on the right is where you just take your normal notes. However you take your notes, you do it like that in there. And on the left side, you notate things. I have questions about this. I don't understand this topic, or this is going to be important for the test, or at between asking yourself questions and pointing things out in your notes that you might find helpful later, that goes on the left side of the column. And so all that can be done in real time, and you may go back when you're studying your notes to add fill in on that left column, start asking yourself questions, maybe answering some of them there so you have it all in your notes. And on the bottom is the most important thing, is where you write a summary of each section of your notes. And the act of writing a summary is one of the more cognitively beneficial tactics you can use, because first you have to take in all the information and kind of read through your notes again, and or when you're paying attention in class, you'll take in all that, and then you run it through your head and then spit something out that you think is what that lecture or that section was about in your own words. And that process of doing that is one of the best things you can do to help build those strong neural pathways. There are other methods of taking notes. There's the outline method, which is probably the most common note-taking method. You can even use the outline method in that center and that box on the right in the Cornell method, but in just a regular outline method, you're just writing notes in an outline. You're not doing the summarizing or the annotating. And then class ends. You put your notes away and you go home. What is the one thing your brain is guaranteed to do in any learning situation? The one thing is you're going to forget stuff. We all do. Brains are designed and on purpose to forget things so your mind doesn't get cluttered with a bunch of useless stuff. So we have to reinforce the things we want to learn. So we're going to do that through studying our notes. Okay, first thing about studying notes is timing. When do you first start studying your notes? If you recall from the first video, the forgetting curve is steepest immediately following the learning event. So within 24 hours, you're going to forget a bunch of stuff. So if you can reinforce that at least once in that 24-hour period, you're going to do a lot to help you not forget and unlearn all the things you just learned in that great lecture that you just had. So as soon as you can, after class, review your notes. I recommend doing it that day. If you have a break between class, that's the perfect time. If you have like several classes in succession, then schedule some time after all those classes to review all of your notes for your classes and get them all done then and get that first pass through your notes. Um, Certainly important to do that in your first 24 hours. And then after that, about 3 days later, you want to revisit your notes and start asking yourself questions, self-quizzing yourself about things in your notes, looking them up in your notes so that you're not just trying to answer questions from memory. You're actually going to where you wrote it down and seeing the context and all the other things going on around that one topic that you're trying to remember. And then you do a third review about a week after that. So basically, maybe an 11-day period, you've interacted with your notes 3 times. And you just repeat the process, self-quizzing things that were unclear to you the second time, you want to strengthen this time, stuff like that. So you had 3 chances to interact with your notes. Okay, so now we've talked about um, when you study, we do a review the first day, and then we do another review 3 days later, and then another third review about a week after that. Um, so now we're going to talk about what you're doing when you're reviewing your notes. So we're going to talk about some strategies. The most common study strategy I've found with most students is rereading your notes. That's probably the cognitively least beneficial of the study strategies most people use, just because when you're doing the same thing over and over again, you don't really yield a lot of additional benefits from that. It doesn't make your understanding deeper or wider. It just keeps going over that same old ground, so you don't really grow from that. So probably the best thing you can do, single best thing, is writing summaries. Like I said earlier, that process of writing summaries, you have to take in all the information, think about what it all means, and then write something in your own words that summarizes that section or whatever the thing is you're summarizing. So that's a pretty powerful thing to do. Um, don't reread, self-quiz. Ask yourself questions about the thing. If you're working in a book chapter, you can get Chat GPT to write you quizzes for those things. Write short answer quizzes, and then instead of trying to answer them first through your memory, go through your notes and find in your notes where all those answers are. And so you see the context in which they occur. So you do another additional pass through your learning and start to strengthen more neural pathways that way. Color coding your notes is also highly recommended. Whether you have color coding a whole day's lecture or just bits and pieces of it for different things that you're doing in your classes, super beneficial. These are called graphic organizers and a really powerful thing for your brains. Once you see that color or that graphic that you use to identify that certain topic, your brain starts filling with all the information that you know about that topic, which makes your studying and learning a lot more productive. And then it was what I call the Marina method. Marina is my stepdaughter. She is now 23 years old. When she was in high school, she was a student who struggled all through elementary and middle school. She has super smart brother and sister who didn't really need to study very hard to get good grades, but she did. She's super smart, but just still needed that study practice. She came up with a method where she writes her notes down on a blank piece of paper, on just a loose leaf sheet of paper, and then right after class, she goes back to her dorm or wherever she can get, and she transcribes her notes into a more permanent notebook, and then starts asking questions, doing the summaries, all the other things that you do in a Cornell method, but she just does that transcribing process. So now she has a set of notes that are more neatly written because it's not done hurriedly in a class. You can take some time out of class and write them more carefully. It also adds some of those summaries and questions, and it also is another that reinforcing step in taking your notes and becomes your first pass through in studying your notes. And note taking is not something that comes natural. We're not taught how to take notes in school for the most part. They're probably just told, write down what you think is important and study from it. So you need to be intentional about it. Come in with a note taking strategy to class. I'm going to use this. I'm going to use the Cornell method, or I'm going to use outline method, whatever that is. But then I'm going to be using this filter, thinking about what the important things are to write down. What do I already know that I don't need to write down stuff I already know again? what are the things that I think are going to be on the test, what are the big connections the professor is making or conclusions that he or she is drawing about the material that are going to help you later. So that is note taking. Um, if anyone has questions, you feel free to post them in the comments or to message me on one of the social media things, and I will be happy to answer any and all questions. You guys have an awesome day.